This gentleman had a question.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of what you described is in keeping with what I've seen, just, I guess, just playing for myself anecdotally.
So can you just speak up a bit, please? A bit of fan effect
But I
going on
just said
behind
I'm
me.
ramble. My question is, when you describe in a lot of these data sets, different populations that or subpopulations you're based on whether they have a psychiatric diagnosis or not, and then I guess a rank order way is severity of psychological symptoms.
Yes.
Have you had a chance to look at the data, if there is a data point that maybe those that do not report having are not identified as having symptoms sufficient for a diagnostic category, like major depressive disorder, doesn't disorder, the physical severity of their injury across those groups?
Yes, have we kept that as a constant? So we've looked at that in terms of regression, for example. In some cases, we've just used specific samples like the soft tissue injury sample. We've excluded people with more serious orthopedic injuries or spinal injuries or traumatic brain injury
And even
issues.
within, like, say, they're all soft tissue injuries, like, there's obviously gray areas. So I would wonder if the actual, like, a medical opinion as to the severity of injuries, for example, range of motion with whiplash, or the ability to lift something in an OC therapy sort of assessment, are those that don't have the diagnosis attributed to them psychiatrically less severe within that range of soft tissue injuries across these areas?
Or if you have a WPI, you could use that.
You could use a WPI. Yeah, so we could look at some cat cases and look at the same similar data. So the short answer is no, we haven't looked at specific gradients within the physical, even as a subcategory of soft tissue injury, for example.
I'm sure the psychiatric played an incredible role. But
Yeah.
I'm also wondering whether it's also explained just simply by the fact that those in the no psychiatric diagnostic sort of subpopulation, they actually have, on average, less of a severe objective medically evaluated injury.
Yeah. Within the field of, say, orthopedics or physiatry, chiropractic field as well, other than doing something like what Dr. Censanis was suggesting in terms of a whole person impairment rating based on the American Medical Association guides, you really don't see. Well, there are gradients in terms of whiplash with or without neurological impairment, with or without losses in range of motion. But beyond those kinds of schemas, you really don't see them. You don't see them in clinical reports for the most part. There's really no attempt to kind of have a pure measure of severity within the soft tissue area, but beyond those kind of more classification.
It's more categorical.
It's more categorical.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think WPI would be a really interesting study.
Yeah, it would. Having said that, though, we know that for the most part, probably 9 out of 10 AMA guides raters would go no more than a 5 to 10% on a neck, on a lumbar.
The variance
The variance is very small. So I think that would be problematic.
Do you want to take some questions, or
Absolutely, yes,
wrap up with
absolutely
anything
open.
else?
No, absolutely open for questions then.
Doug, if you are going to take questions, can you just repeat the question just for the sake of the video?
Sure.
It would be better.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, guys. Anybody have any other questions, comments?
I have another question. Is there, I'm guessing, long term, because you've obviously spent quite some time trying to quantify the rehabilitative or recovery of those with, for example, non-traumatic or traumatic brain injuries, in the context of also having other sorts of physical injuries and emotional difficulties. Do you see possibly this being integrated somehow into like what we use in a standardized way, like with OCF forms, the same way that we still have them right now, where the OCF3 is the exact same way, it needs improvement. The way that OCALs submit their OCFs, there's the same sort of setup that needs improvement. Is that kind of like where you want us to go, or is to keep it as a separate psychological measure used by psychologists kind of thing?
No, it's very much an interdisciplinary measure with the idea that we all need to be more interdisciplinary in our focus. Psychologists have a better idea of what's going on physically. Physical folks have to have a better idea of what's going on mental health-wise. Both fields outside of neuropsychology are oftentimes missing, important cognitive variables. And again, the idea of different phases, that if I'm going to be discharging somebody today, it's my responsibility, no matter what my discipline, to survey the person to understand where do they need to go next, what's the next rehab phase. If that means it's just that they've gone as far as they can with me physically and they're psychologically and cognitively fine, well then maybe it's a vocational rehab question. Or maybe it's a work hardening question to go further to make more of a difference between the work-related activities and the person's current capacity. But ultimately, we all have to be much more global, much more comprehensive, holistic in our approach, and do the patient a service, the client a service, by identifying where the existing barriers still are and making the referral. That's all it really is, making the referral to
really
the
is
party.
congruent with a lot of the things that we've been studying more systematically in our lab. And some of the research that even Elias has done and is doing really demonstrates that specific cognitive tasks, looking at very specific cognitive constructs, are not predictive of real-world activity. And that makes intuitive sense, even though historically we haven't thought like that. But if you put yourself in the real world, it's not just your working memory, it's not just your problem solving, it's not just your attentional ability, it's not just your visual spatial. All of this stuff is active at the exact same time.
Exactly.
And so when someone draws a conclusion from neuropsychological tests that someone is not disabled in their real world because they only see an impairment in one specific because of one cognitive domain, it's ridiculous.
Right.
And so this sort of multi-analysis, multi-level bird's eye perspective that this measure brings, I think is so wonderful. I think that's why it's brought us together to do some great research, and a lot of people in this room, I think we'll learn that next year when we're employing this measure in some of the studies we'll be doing. So I really applaud the fact that you really speak to what it is that I think is important, because we're talking about people's lives at the end of the day, and I think sometimes clinicians forget that the real ramifications of our decisions. We spoke about this in my neuropsychology class the other day, of just how paramount our diagnostic decisions can be. And again, you kind of pointed out that clinicians often forget the limitations of our tests. And so having an outcome measure like this, I think, reminds us to be mindful of what could be really going on in their real world. So, excellent.
Great.
Right. Wonderful presentation. Does anyone have any last questions? Or maybe we could stop now and you guys can speak to Doug more.
Sure, I'll be around for a while,
bit.
so don't be shy about coming up
But
and
before we
introducing
do
yourself.
that,
ask
I want to
questions.
thank Doug for sharing his time with the University of Toronto Scarborough and here in the Department of Psychology, and more particularly our lab. So thank you so much for a great talk.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.